when you have to get a really big world-changing kind of idea across and you have an incredibly small amount of time, the best way to do it is to tell a story. Because a story cuts right through all of the stuff. If and that's why, you think once upon a time, I mean, you're not going to hear a TED speaker or a business speaker start with once upon a time, but it's in there, in all the great TED Talks. It's right underneath the language as once upon a time. And there's like, if I even just right now, if I say to you, Alicia, in 2005, I was sitting in history class. Okay, now I have no idea where that was going, but the second I do that, your storytelling brain is just triggered right away. You're like, I'm in. It's so engaging. It's a human compulsion that if I start to paint a picture or put a mental camera in your head, you just want to know what's coming next. What's coming next?
You hit the once upon a time button.
Exactly, the once upon a time button. That's exactly right.
Prehistoric cavemen be like, me want story.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there are a few birds' nests propping this thing up. Yeah,
it looks like it. Bird's nests, probably a moose in there somewhere, just wandering around. It's
definitely. It's not a good sign when you have to explain your costume, but this is a caveman wig apparently.
Oh, great!
And which tied into our theme of
storytelling. Perfect.
And I do have this like elaborate beard that goes with it, but I didn't put it on because I was afraid that I actually wouldn't be able to carry on the interview with it. It doesn't really look that caveman either.
No, it really just looks like every dude after a year of COVID. It was just we all gave up for a while. Yeah.
Brian Miller, thank you so much for returning to this prehistoric existential storytelling cave where we will light a campfire today and let our hair hang out and have a wonderful time discussing story within story within story within story. How does that sound?
It sounds like all of my favorite things. It's meta, it's philosophy, it's storytelling. I'm just gonna have to remember not to have any light bulb moments because, of course, we're in the cave now. We're in the prehistoric era. Maybe a little fireplace will pop up over my head if I have a good idea.
Well, or it could be some embers, some
yeah, that's right.
cinder sparks
just
that
some
go
sparks.
flying up.
I like that idea. I wish I had that in my actual life when I had a good idea. Yeah.
Well, nowadays, you can always Photoshop that in.
That's true. And pretty soon we'll all just be living in VR. So it's all good. I mean, Elon bought Twitter. What's next for humanity? We don't know.
That's right. So wonderful. Since you say you love meta, maybe I can kick us off that way and ask you, where did storytelling enter your storied life?
Yeah, storytelling for me probably, well later in life did I actually understand what I enjoyed about it. I never would have called it this, but my father, he refused to let me watch Sesame Street. And I know this sounds like a weird place to start, but he flat out refused Sesame Street. Of course, now we know Sesame Street as one of the great innovations in education for children on TV, but he was worried when I was a kid that it was catering to a low attention span, that it was flipping through topics too quickly. And he's an academic.
Wow, he was ahead of his time.
Yeah, he's a researcher. He's a scientist, and so he couldn't be sure, but he was nervous that it was flipping too fast between topics. And so what he wanted me to be able to develop a proper attention span, and so he forced me to watch full movies. So we never watched the Sesame Street-esque shows that were designed for kids. If we were going to watch TV, it would be a full movie, Disney movies, of course. So we would sit down and watch a 90-minute movie from start to finish. His idea was he wanted me to be able to follow a plot and story and characters and arcs and to be able to talk about them. And so as long as I can remember, the Disney-style storytelling, which is, of course, rooted right in classical heroes' journeys, it's just part of my anatomy. It's part of who I am. And I had the great privilege of just the good luck of being born during the Disney Renaissance. So every movie I got to see in theaters was all the ones that are the most famous now: Aladdin, Lion King, Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast. That was my childhood. So it was just like perfect timing in the universe.
So, due to your father's value on longer attention span development, you were steeped in the Disney genre, which in turn had embedded within it the hero's journey structure.
Yeah.
So, really, from childhood, unbeknownst to you, through your father's good intentions, this sort of structure of story was kind of being mapped out, I would imagine, in
Yeah.
your brain.
It certainly seems that way. If I look backwards, I never, until you asked me that, I never really thought about where my interest in storytelling, because I like as a professional these days, I fell backwards into storytelling as an art form. It was I never pursued it. I never studied it until I started doing a certain type of work professionally that required me to be able to explain to other people what I seemed to intuitively understand is really where my current interest in story came from. Is I know how to do this stuff for myself, but I need to be able to explain this to people who don't. And so that's when I started studying story. Yeah.
Okay. Well, as an existentialist, I'm a big fan of falling backwards. So I was hoping, can we just unpack that for a second?
Sure.
Can we talk about how you fell backwards into story?
Yeah, I mean, I fell backwards into story, so I feel like we're literally going to memento this. We're going to like be slowly moving backwards in this story in a meta way. But I fell backwards into story when I got really steeped in my work with speakers, with TED speakers, TEDx speakers, leaders who need to give keynotes and business talks. And I as a kind of a speaking coach consultant, I needed to figure out how to help them get their ideas across in a way that was engaging and entertaining, but also served a purpose. And so I knew how I've always done it as a speaker and previously as a magician and, you know, as a songwriter and like all kinds of other ways. But yeah, so I in my work with TED speakers, and folks giving business talks, I needed to figure out how to explain what I knew intuitively or what I knew how to do intuitively. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so we're mementoing backwards through time, and it sounds like at some point, you know, you were pushed into this work that you're currently doing, helping develop TED Talks with people who want to conquer red dots, and you had to sort of reverse engineer what you were doing as a speaker, the elements of story that you were utilizing there. Then also, I imagine you reverse engineered that through your career in magic. And as you said, even backwards towards where you were a young musician and mathematician, of course. And, and even like you were drawing upon that deep part of the brain that had been inculcated unbeknownst to you in the hero's journey in childhood.
Yeah, inculcated. Good word. Good word. 10, how many Scrabble points is
Not a
that?
very prehistoric word. I
No.
apologize. The caveman in me apologizes.
No, that probably, can you just imagine them sitting around the campfire and that word coming out? Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no,
They
I
would
mean,
oust me immediately. They would detect that I was an alien invader.
that in fact you were a time traveler. They definitely would have said wormhole. They would have invented the word wormhole in that moment. That would have that's probably the origin, I imagine. Yeah, no, it worked. It worked backwards. I feel like that's, you know, if I work backwards through my thoughts about that, I mean, probably the closest time in my life previous to actually doing the work of story that I understood it was magic. I feel like through 10 years in full-time magic is where I really developed an understanding of story because, you know, magicians, and we talked about this a little bit last time, but magicians do this really weird, like psychological human experiments with people. It's really bizarre what magicians do, and in many ways, I've heard neuroscientists say that magicians actually understand human psychology better than they do. We just don't know how to describe it. We don't know how to, you know, what the words are to use to describe it and to replicate it. But
wow.
So yeah, so in that way, magicians. There was a brilliant magician who once, I remember on a documentary once, he said, "As magicians, whoever tells the best story wins." And I just thought that's it, right? Because you're presenting something that's impossible, that the audience knows is impossible. It cannot happen what they're seeing. And yet, in that moment, they're convinced it's happening anyway. So how do you get someone there? You have to tell them a story. You have to tell them a story. Yeah.
I love that. Whoever tells the best story wins.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I heard this magician Michael Weber say that, but I've heard it said so many times in different places. I think it's one of those sayings that just kind of exists out there in the ether, like anonymous. You know, I'm not sure where it comes from, but it's literally how the world works when you really think about it.
Well, I do think that's probably comes from campfire prehistoric times.
Yeah, it probably does, and you can trace story all the way, like you said, back to, you know, we think about the campfire. You can trace it back to culture and religion and conquering, and the fact that whoever won a war got to write the story. We know that history is written by the winners, and so it's even just here in the States. You know, to get a little bit less silly for a second, we look at how American students learn about the history of America, and then you talk to literally any student from anywhere else in America, and they have been told a very different story about America.
You mean anywhere else in the world, you mean?
Anywhere else in the world. What did I say?
Yes. You said America again. So
oh, did I? Oh, good.
Sure
Good. Yeah. Anywhere else in the world outside of America. And
you can't escape silly when you're with me.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Very good.
It's not allowed.
Oh, that's true. I mean, it's so funny. Even
that was me doing a little like Vulcan silly mind melt.
It was good. I appreciate that. Well, literally this morning I was having a chat with one of my clients who's in Norway, and he mentioned the fact that he said, you know, there's 6.5. I think he said there's 6.5 million people in Norway, and I said, wait, did you say 6.5 million people in Norway, like in the whole country? And he said, yeah. I said, because there's 8.5 million people in New York City. Like it just, you know, and that kind of a moment just makes you realize how different stories are being told in different places. Just the world is, it's steeped in story. And so it's important to be aware of what stories are being told, who's telling them, and what their agenda is in telling those stories. And I think that's a lot of where my interest comes from.
Great. So if we do go back to where we were in the timeline, that as a magician, you had to start utilizing story, but you weren't necessarily fully cognizant that you were doing that.
Right.
You were learning the craft, you were practicing the art, and storytelling was sort of interwoven in that. And therefore you were using it without necessarily knowing the principles, I would imagine.
Right.
And so how did that evolve then? I mean, you had your viral at TEDx talk. That sort of, if I'm right, that catapulted you from your work in magic over into sort of the keynote speaking area.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That was I had given talks before, but they were one-offs, and I wasn't trying to become a speaker, but this changed that. Yeah.
So as you became a speaker, is that when the principles of storytelling became more important for you to use? And
yeah, I mean, developing the TEDx itself, I had to do tremendous amount of research into storytelling, because, you know, that's what the power of TED has always been, is really the time limit on it. It used to be 18 minutes or less at the beginning of TED, because back when TED started, they had scientifically determined that 18 minutes was the exact right amount of time. It was long enough for a full, complete thought, but it was short enough that people could actually stay focused and implement on it. Today, most TEDx talks are 10 minutes. It's usually 12 or less, and some of them are pushing for 8. So, you know, you can feel attention spans getting shorter. But the great thing about TED is it forces a level of clarity onto your idea that you've never had before. And so when you have to get a really big world-changing kind of idea across, and you have an incredibly small amount of time, the best way to do it is to tell a story, because a story cuts right through all of the stuff. If you know, and that's why, you know, you think once upon a time. I mean, you're not going to hear a TED speaker or a business speaker start with once upon a time, but it's in there in all the great TED Talks. It's right underneath the language is once upon a time. And there's like, if I even just right now, if I say to you, Alicia, in 2005, I was sitting in history class. Okay, now I have no idea where that was going, but the second I do that, your storytelling brain is just triggered right away. You're like, I'm in. It's so engaging. It's a human compulsion that if I start to paint a picture or put a mental camera in your head, you just want to know what's coming next. What's coming next?
You hit the once upon a time button.
Exactly, the once upon a time button. That's exactly right. And so when I was working on my own TEDx talk, I had to think, well, I wanted to talk about perspective taking, the ability to understand different points of view, and how I had learned that as a magician. And I was writing the talk, and it was kind of coming out clinical, kind of academic, which made sense because I was an academic essentially. And it was my friend and mentor Zoe Chance at Yale School of Management, who's since become very, very, very famous. She said to me one day, she said, Brian, there's years ago, you told me a story of something that happened to you one night at a restaurant that I've never forgotten. She said, it's like one of my favorite stories. I tell it to other people. She said, do you remember when a blind guy came into the restaurant and you couldn't figure out, you didn't even realize he was blind, you couldn't figure out how to do magic for him? I was like, oh yeah. I had just forgotten that had happened because it wasn't a story I was telling. It was just a moment in time. It happened. I happened to tell Zoe and one or two other people and had moved on with my life. And she said that story is such a great example of the power of perspective taking, which is what your whole talk's about. Tell that story in your talk. And so all credit to Zoe for noticing the story itself, that story has made me very famous in certain circles. And it wasn't me. I didn't think about it. And I figured out how to tell it. And in figuring out how to tell it, like, there's a lot more to that story than I actually told in the TED Talk. And of course, because there's a lot more to every story than you could possibly tell in a tiny little window. I had to tell that story in 2 minutes, 3 minutes at most. And so I started to read about story structure and what are the core components, what has to be in here, what doesn't, how much detail, do I include my own failures or not? How does that affect the audience? All these things that ultimately became the story that I hung my TED Talk off of. And it's the anchor. It's the anchor that people remember the message through.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can give credit to Zoe.
Yeah.
Chance.
All credit
that.
to Zoe.
And it's like she pulled this core thread out of the tapestry of what she knew of you.
Yeah.
And it turns out that thread is also runs through your work as a human connection specialist.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. It ended up, these two different aspects of my world, my own speaking career and human connection, and my consulting work for speakers and leaders and, storytelling and messaging. Sometimes I call myself a messaging consultant because I'm not sure what else to call it. It's not strictly communication. It's really messaging. But those two, if you want to really connect powerfully with someone, especially in a one-to-many situation. Like, there's a lot of my human connection work I do with organizations, with students, where we're talking about one-to-one relationships. And I do a lot of that. But the world we live in now, especially kind of post-COVID, we're almost always in a one-to-many now. I feel like one-to-many is becoming increasingly common. And if you want to do one-to-many, you really need to tell stories. Because one-to-one, you can put your hand on the person's shoulder. You can simply be in their presence and not say anything and still feel a connection. But that doesn't happen on a Zoom call with 500 people, right? If you want to connect with 500 people on a Zoom call, tell a story that speaks to some fundamental truth that everyone can put their own experiences on. They can imagine something they've gone through or some desire or some need or want, and they can connect with you in their own way if you are being specific about your story.
Okay, fabulous. So there you were, digging through the details to put together your TEDx talk.
Yeah.
And your friend and mentor, Zoe Chance, found this, thread in the tapestry of your life that was the kind of like vein of gold to put into the talk to create the foundation of story that you needed. And so you found that story that fits so perfectly, or she helped you to find that, and then that vein of story allowed you to have this not only TEDx experience for yourself, but one that became very profound and meaningful to others and went viral. Take me from there forward into how story continued to unfold for you, to present day, where you help others craft their stories.
Yeah, so the immediate next step was I started getting invited all over the world to fly in and give talks at really important conferences that I had no business being on stage talking at. I really was just kind of hanging out in my clown shoes. And I was like, I'm a magician. When people started inviting me to talk about human connection and to kick off conferences, and sometimes in front of really important groups, one of the first major calls I got was an invitation-only gathering of world-class oncologists from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And there were 3 keynotes. It was 2 world-class oncologists with 40 years in groundbreaking research in the field, and me. And I was kicking off the whole conference, the whole 3 days in Barcelona or whatever it was. And I always remember that one because I've never felt more like an imposter in my life. And I was trying to prepare for that. And, they're like, well, just do the TED Talk, but for longer. And it was like, that's all well and good, but I only have 14 minutes and 11 seconds to say on that topic. I'm not an academic. I'm not an expert. This is just what I learned as a magician. So I had to think, I got to expand this out. I don't want to go too heavy into the science and research because I'm not really qualified to talk about that. That was back then. Now I'm a lot more qualified, but I wasn't qualified then. So I thought, well, the only way I can fill out this presentation and still make the point is to tell more stories. So I was like, okay, I've got one, but I can't just tell this one 3-minute story for the rest of my life about the blind guy in the restaurant. Plus 3.5 million people have seen it. Everybody who hires me has already seen that story. They've heard that story. That's one of the tricky parts about getting hired to keynote is sometimes the organizer will tell me, we sent your TED Talk to everybody in advance of you coming here. And I'm like, great. So now I can't tell that story. The one story you hired me for.
Thanks a lot.
Or worse, when they introduce you and give away the end of the story in the introduction, when they say, so Brian's going to come, and you're not going to believe this story about a blind guy in the restaurant. Brian, come up and tell him. I'm like, well, that's the surprise. So there it is. So I'm trying to come up with how do I flesh this out and still make it meaningful and make it land and make it relevant? And how am I going to distinguish my time on the stage from these people who are actually experts in what this conference is about? And I started digging and mining through my experiences for relevant stories. And I found 1 or 2 that are literally still to this day in every single keynote I do. They've become staples. I found them right away and they've become staples. And I tell them better and clearer than I used to. But the first time I told, I chose a story I had never told anyone in my life. Forget in public. I had never told it in my life. I chose it to close that keynote, which is a bad idea. But it went really well. It's a recommendation I would never give. When I used to coach magicians, I would tell them never open or close the show with a new piece. Always stick a new piece dead center in the middle of the show so that there's plenty of time to get the audience to love you. And then if it doesn't go well, there's plenty of time left to recover from it, right? Never open or close with a new piece. But I needed a closer, and I didn't have a real closer. And so I told this story, which in a very meta level was actually the story of Zoe. It was the story of how I met Zoe and what it led to. And it became this really famous story for me now. It's like probably my second most famous story is the I like your hat story, how I met this lady on a plane who said, I like your hat, and it changed the course of my life. And I use it to...
A chance encounter.
A chance encounter with Zoe Chance, yes. That sometimes life just gifts you those moments. Those are... You can't look for or write those. But I was like, oh, a chance encounter. How about that? But yeah, so that was the next step for me in storytelling was now I need to learn how to find stories on purpose. That was really the next step.
Okay, so due to this high-level keynote event that you found yourself at, you were forced to really start mining your life for these stories
Yeah.
and draw upon them. And then as you did that, it sounds like you kind of found your way forward with the use of stories and developed that skill and ability.
Yeah. Yeah. And I told stories that didn't work after that point many, many times. It was a long process then from that point. It's like, it's very similar to how a young comedian will kill their first time or two on stage and then bomb the next 10 sets. You know, that beginner's luck where, because you've got so much nervous energy, that actually is very authentic, and it really is very endearing to an audience when they can see you're working hard and trying. And but then when you start to get confident, well, I've told this story twice and it killed, or I've told this joke twice and it killed, so now I'm confident it's going to land. It turns out the joke wasn't as good as you thought it was, and now without that nervous energy, you're not endearing anymore, and then comedians start bombing. Something similar happened to me. Not that the stories I told in that first major keynote failed, but that I got confident in. I started to think like, oh, I can make any story entertaining. I can just tell any story that's entertaining and it will land. And it turns out, no, it's not merely telling a story. It's making sure the story is aligned to the message. And that's the difference between telling a story to your friend over coffee and telling a story on stage or on a YouTube channel or in a LinkedIn post for making a point, right? That the story has to obviously lead to a point that the audience can benefit from. And learning to find those stories and find out how to tell the right story in the right way to make the right point was a years-long trial and error process of very painfully telling stories that clearly you can watch the audience glazing over going, I don't understand why he's telling me this or where it's going. So yeah, that was the next step.
So you did fail forward. You
always
kind of
fail
discovered-
forward.
Sorry. We'll have to leave that in.
Yeah, just leave it in. You should make an entire TikTok of you doing that. Yeah. Just let people take that sound and put it into their own videos. Become like the Wilhelm scream. There's a famous scream in cinema history. Like, it was recorded like 80 years ago. There's like one guy screaming, and now I think it's like in a library where it's like anybody can use it. And so every single action movie, every director gets the Wilhelm scream somewhere in their movie. And it's like, if you're a movie nut, you can just listen. At some point, you hear it in the background in the middle of some random act, and you're like, there it is. There's the Wilhelm scream. It's like a little Where's Waldo for cinema fans. You could do that for TikTok with your throat clearing.
Well, thank you. You know, you've just given me a little absurd moment in history for the day. I really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
So you started to, first you hit you got the beginner's luck moment. Then you started to hit your Dunning-Kruger, where you start to realize that you didn't know what you didn't know. And then I would assume, being the sort of world-class intellect and student that you are, you turned your attention onto learning the principles of storytelling and, deploying those skills. And so how did that evolve into the place where you are now, where you actually teach others to tell stories for the sake of becoming TEDx speakers?
Yeah, like so many things in my life and in my career, that was... I hesitate to use the word luck, and I think you and I talked about luck a little bit last time, but the first time I coached a TEDx speaker was they emailed me cold. Somebody emailed me and said, hey, you gave one of the best TEDx talks ever. I'm giving my first TEDx talk in a few months. Do you ever help people give their TEDx talk? Literally just said, I don't see anything on your web. I mean, I was still a magician for 50% of my career at that point. I was still half a magician, half a speaker. I hadn't even fully transitioned yet. And, she said, can you help me? And I was like, I mean, I can try. It was kind of a sure, sounded like, sounded like an interesting thing. so much of my
This
philosophy.
is me just saying yes to life.
Yeah, it really is. You know, that Jim Carrey movie, Yes Man, you know, I mean, you can take, and that movie showed the absurd conclusion of that philosophy. Like, you can't actually say yes to everything. But for me, most of my success, whatever you would call that, is say yes first, figure it out later, you know, and I say yes to almost everything, especially when it's a new opportunity. Somebody says, here's something that we think you'd be good at, or would you be interested in doing this? And I think to myself, I've never done that before, but wouldn't it be interesting to find out if I could do that? Right. And then I do it, and then I decide if it's something I want to continue doing based on that experience. And so somebody said, can you help me on my TEDx talk? And I said, sure. And, you know, I charged peanuts. I mean, it was silly what I was charging for it, because I didn't feel comfortable charging anything really, because I didn't know what I was doing. But it was tremendously successful. It went so well. That talk got 250,000 views, which in the world of TED is, I mean, it's substantial. People think of millions of views, but like the average TEDx talk gets like 400 views. You just never see them because they disappear on YouTube. So like it got like 250,000 views, and this client used the talk as leverage to fulfill their dream of getting out of the 9 to 5 and founding their own consultancy. And now, years later, has this incredible boutique consultancy with a staff of 10 and all this, like it was incredible. And I watched this happen, and I was like, oh, right. Okay, right. Here's a way that I can serve that's different from getting on stages, that's different from doing card tricks, that, you know, and is one-to-one. And I, as much as we talked earlier about a lot of this world now is one-to-many, I thrive in one-to-one, which is why I don't run group programs, and, you know, in my own work. And I really love working with people one-on-one. And so that client, then 2 months later, I got an email from somebody that said, hey, I got your name from so-and-so. They said you helped them. Would you also help me? And it just was like one referral at a time that I started working with people on their own TED Talks. And today, a lot of the work I do is TED is a tiny part of that. It's like the launching pad to build an even bigger platform. But it just happened over time.
Oh, okay. Could you explain that further? So, one of the levels of what you help people with is crafting their TEDx talk.
Yeah.
But did you just say that's the beginning point?
Yeah, now it is. It used to be the only thing I offered as a coach. You know, that was the only thing I offered as a speaker coach. Now I think only 10%, maybe 15% of my one-on-one clients are only doing TED with me. And everybody else, 80-85% of my clients are doing TED, but only as the launching pad to much, much more. That they're looking to build careers in thought leadership, to be speaking and consulting, to be on bigger stages, to develop platforms, you know, for themselves, to build a mission or a business bigger than themselves. And they want to start with the cachet of the red dot, the kind of instant expert status, and, you know, that you get from being on a TED stage. But that's not their end goal. So it used to be, I only worked with people where my work with them ended the day they gave their TED Talk. Now, my work starts about 2 or 3 months before the TED Talk and continues for 7, 8 months, a year, 2 years past it, depending on who I'm working with. Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. Given all that you learned about story over the course of this progression in your career, what is it that you'd like people to know now about the power of story?
The power of story is that it invites the listener to discover something about themselves that they could have never found on their own. Because we get trapped in our own stories. Our limited, what makes us each a unique individual is also what prevents us largely from connecting with people and from seeing the bigger picture, which is that I have a unique set of experiences. You have a unique set of experiences. And even though you might occasionally come across somebody who's had similar experiences, they will never be identical or even close. And that's all well and good. And it's what makes life so interesting. But the more you know about something, the harder it is to explain it to an outsider. This is called the problem of knowledge. And this is the same thing that happens to people with their own stories. You know your own story better than anything else in the world. And because of that, you think that either my story, your story, you would think your story is boring because you've lived it, so it's not interesting to you. So either you think your story is boring, so it's not worth sharing, or you think everyone else must think and believe similar things that I do because these things are so obvious to me because I've lived my life. And both of those things are wrong. And this is why storytelling is so useful, because when we tell our story, we give people the chance to see something new about themselves by seeing their own experiences through the eyes of somebody else, through the perspective of somebody else. And when we hear stories, that happens for us. When we hear stories, this is why, filmmaking is such an extraordinary, art form. And some people, there's plenty of people that downplay, like the Oscars and stuff. And like, we can all admit there's something antiquated in the self-congratulatory awards ceremonies. But fundamentally, like, the Oscars were designed to be, a celebration of story and the power of story. And that is what it does. I'm never going to, be a spy, winding my way across Europe and defeating bad guys. But through James Bond movies, I can imagine a better version of myself that I would like to be and I aspire to by seeing characteristics that I either enjoy in the character or don't, and this is what story does in our actual lives. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, great. I mean, I love how that ties through to your own purpose. Like, it seems like one of your deeper missions in life is to expand perspective for people. And you started that with magic and carried it through to your TED Talk. And so even the way that you teach story is to let people share their story such that it enriches the perspective of others.
Yeah, I get asked. There's a moment with every speaker I'm working with leading towards a TEDx talk. There's a moment, I can almost predict it, which session and at what point in that session it's going to happen, because it's so common, where the client will kind of break down and go, we've been working on this for months. And I'm giving this talk in a few weeks. Is anybody going to care about this? There's always this moment of doubt where, is anybody going to care about my story? Like, this is so stupid. And it's really, people really feel this thing that I went through this is selfish to be talking about this on a stage. And it's only selfish if you're talking about it for your own benefit, right? Do that with your therapist, do that with your best friend or your mom, but not on a stage. So it's selfish if you're talking about it for your own benefit. But if you're sharing your story for the purpose of the audience, somebody else being able to feel seen or heard or understood or valued or notice themselves in a better light, or see something that they could aspire to, something that they actually want, and now they can see proof that it really happened for somebody else. And if it can happen for this person on stage that I've never heard of, maybe it can happen for me too. Then it's selfless, right? Then it's generous to share your story. And I think it's critical that more people share their stories, and that's the best thing about the digital world and social media. There's plenty of bad things about social media. We hear about them all day, all the time. It's terrible. It's ruining this, attention spans, blah, blah, blah. Fine. But it also gave everybody a voice. And because it gave everybody a voice, we got the social change generation, an entire, Gen Z is what I call the social change generation. It's an entire generation of people that far younger than you would have ever expected in life are deeply concerned about issues of humanity and fairness and justice. And it's changing the world. It's literally changing the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Brian, you just said that you feel it's critical that more people share their stories. And you did explain earlier why you see it that way, but could you say again, kind of synopsize, if that's a verb, why you feel that way?
Yeah, people should share their stories because it's how we connect to other humans. It's how we connect to ourselves, and it's how we connect to others. You can't connect with somebody else until you really know who you are, not fully, not completely. And I think this is the fundamental problem of connection in the divisive age that we're in right now, is that people don't really fully understand their own story. They don't know how to tell their own story. And when I say tell, I don't just mean tell to other people or tell on a stage. The story you tell yourself about who you are will determine how you live your life. And it's really important to understand how you tell your story.
So it's important to understand how you tell your personal narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. Because the story, there's so many people that tell themselves the story, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I don't deserve this opportunity, you're never going to be happy, that little voice at the back of our head all day, every day that just like chatters away. Every single person you meet and interact with has their own version of that voice. And once you realize that, it humbles you, and it means you can't treat people as transactions anymore. You have to appreciate the interaction that you're having in that moment for that person. And that comes from story.
Beautiful. So, you're basically calling for awareness for each of us of our personal narrative, and then extending that awareness to others with a consideration that they're trapped in their narrative.
Yeah. I think it's fundamental work, and that's slightly different. That's slightly different than what we were talking about earlier, which is kind of the business and craft of storytelling as a speaker and as a thought leader. But you can't get to that point until you understand why your story matters and what it is and why it's worth telling anyway. Yeah.
So it is kind of a bit of a wormhole. Like you start just studying the structure of story, and as you go through that structure, I imagine there's the meta aspect of it, and before you know it, you're down deep in your own personal narrative.
Yeah.
Chasing windmills and cobwebs, and perhaps even starting your hero's journey.
Yeah. And then once you believe that your story is, once you know what your story is and you believe that it's worth telling, then the science and the psychology and the craft of storytelling matter, because just because you know your story and you believe it's worth telling doesn't mean you automatically engage and excite an audience. It obviously doesn't. You can tell a story, you can tell a good story very badly, and you can tell a bad story very well. And
more goodly.
Yeah, and more goodly. Yeah, exactly. And this goes back to a lot of what I learned in magic, which was there's always a debate in magic. Are there actually any bad magic tricks, or are there just magic tricks done badly? And it's a big question. I think there are bad magic tricks. But I also think that even the worst magic tricks can be done very well. I've seen magicians do tricks that I believe are fundamentally bad magic tricks that don't deserve wasting the audience's time. I've seen magicians do those exact tricks and have the audience laughing for 10 minutes. I don't think it was a very
magic.
Yeah, I do. I see. I'm also this whole time I'm trying to imagine what the green screen is going to look like, which sounds silly if I'm saying this and you're watching the event, because you don't see what I'm seeing. You, the audience listening to this right now, watching this right now, but I'm looking at a green screen suit and trying to imagine what's going to be there in place of that suit. I'm excited. It'll be a nice surprise.
Well, I have to put my beard on and stroke my beard for a second. You will find out.
Very good. Very good. That was very intriguing. Yes. We should gift that. I need that as a gift to send to other people.
It can be arranged. So taking us back, you just said that it's important to know what your story is. Then it's important to know that your story is worth telling. And then it's important to learn the craft of storytelling for the sake of telling your story such that others will benefit from it.
Yes, absolutely. Perfect. That was a perfect, very succinctly, you said everything I've taken 45 minutes to say. It was beautiful.
So is there anything you'd add to that?
No, I mean, the after, to add to that would be to dive into the science and kind of structure of storytelling itself. And I'm not sure if that's where this conversation wants to go. But, there's all kinds of interesting, there's like tiny little quick shortcuts that you could like make this one tiny change and all your stories will immediately be 50% better. There's like quick stuff like that. And then there's also just depth, hours and hours of stuff to talk about. I can give you an example though of a quick thing. Anybody, if you're listening to this and you are trying to tell your story, even just like in conversation with your friend, or if you have a business meeting, if you occasionally have to stand up in front of your colleagues or executives at work, or you're involved in a community group,
or if you time travel back to a prehistoric campfire and need to make sure that you make friends at that campfire.
Absolutely. If you have a sales presentation for a bunch of cavemen, you definitely need to know how to do this. It's really important. Bring your Excel spreadsheets. So here's a really quick hack, and I forget who I learned this from. None of this is my own genius. I feel like what I've done is curate, is be the guy who obsessively knows inside and out everything that's been said and knows how to pull in the right thing at the right time. I think that's what I do for my clients more than anything. I didn't invent any of this, but I'll give you an example of something that immediately made my own keynotes. And this is something that I changed after I was a successful speaker. I'd gone through the growing pains. I'd made it. I was getting top rated speaker at every conference. I was already that. And I found a little thing that made every keynote 50% better than it already was, I would say. And it's this. Anytime you can switch the word I for you are better off. Anytime you can switch the word I for you. And I'll give you a perfect example. Very early in every keynote that I do, this is my How to Magically Connect with Anyone keynote. It's based on the TED Talk. It's where I make most of my living as a speaker. Every time I open that keynote, somewhere towards the very beginning, I say the phrase, I used to say, I'm trying to remember what I used to say now because what I currently say is embedded in my head. What I used to say was, when I was a magician, so this was the phrase, I would say, when I was a magician, the most important part of my job was not tricking people. It was connecting with people. Okay, now that's fine, right? You get it. You get what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And then I switched I for you, and it becomes this. When you're a magician, the most important part of your job is not tricking people. It's connecting with people. Completely different tone. Completely different. You receive it totally differently. Because when I say when you're a magician, you have to imagine being a magician. You have to. Because that's what our brains do. Our brains are story machines. But when I say I, you don't have to imagine anything because you're not involved at all. When I say when I was a magician, you're looking at me and you don't have to imagine anything because you're looking at me, the guy who used to be a magician. But when I say when you're a magician, it forces your brain. It's like saying don't think of a pink elephant. You have to think of a pink elephant. There's no other way. And so it forces the storytelling brain on. And if you can just switch I for you, oh my God, I couldn't believe how many years I had wasted that opportunity in my speeches. And I went, wow, never again, So there's a quick hack for telling a story.
I love it. So when you're a absurd caveman, you must switch I for you.
Exactly.
And therefore, you will connect much more deeply with others. One to many.
Perfect.
So, Brian, we can revisit some of the larger topics that we've touched upon here today, such as more to do with magic, more to do with hero's journey. But since you're in hack mode, I'm wondering, is there a little sort of teaser that you could give to those listening, especially to our cricket followers, about the hero's journey and the art of storytelling?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm going to say something that you may have heard before, but it bears repeating because it's a technique that is really simple, but it's not easy. And it's this. Your story, you are the hero of your story, right? So you're thinking about your personal narrative we've talked about earlier. You're the hero of your story. But when you're talking to anyone else, when you are speaking with, especially if it's an audience, whether it's 3 people or 300 or 3,000, when you're speaking with somebody else, they are the hero of the story of your conversation, essentially, or the story of your talk. And this is the number one thing that people get wrong in business. I see literally all the way from, the local plumber all the way up to billion-dollar multinational corporations. I see the exact same problem on their website, which is the plumber, the corporation, they are the hero of the journey that is laid out on the website. That look how amazing this company is. Look what this company went through. Look how hard it was for this company. Look how great they came out. And you're sitting there as the potential customer going, just none of this is about me. Where am I in any of this? And again, this is simple, but it's not easy. You have to put the audience, the intended audience, whether it's business or casual, you have to put them in the role of the hero. They're on a journey. They're trying to solve a problem. They've got a quest. Not every problem is actually a quest and not whatever, but like loosely, they're the ones that are going on a journey, and you are meeting them at some point during their journey. And you see me doing a circle here because I think of the hero's journey not in the traditional linear sense. I think of it in a modern story circle sense, which we can get into next time because it's really interesting. But you are going to meet the audience at some point in their journey. And the trick is knowing at what point in their journey are you meeting them. Because if you're meeting them at step 4, you want to use different language, different tone, different questions to chat with them versus if you're meeting them in step 7 or step 9, right? Depending on where you meet them, you need to meet them where they're at. And that means you need to use different language, different tone, different rhythm. And we forget this all the time. We get so excited about our own ideas and our own services. People come into I coach people who are consultants and coaches and speakers. And so they get on a discovery call with somebody who's thinking about hiring them to do a speech or something. And they want to get on and be like, listen to how amazing my speech is. And I've done all these great things. And I'm the top rated speaker at every conference. And I'm the this and I'm the that. And the client's been lost in that. That you have no idea if they need to know any of that information, right? So that would be my quick hack is really just be aware or figure out where the audience is in their hero's journey so that you know how to talk to them when they meet you.
Mm-hmm. So place your audience in their own hero's journey.
Yeah. You don't even have to place them. They're in it. You have to recognize that it's their journey and not yours when you meet them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that really kind of ties it back to your skill in human connection as well. You really have to kind of leave yourself and form that bridge to that person, discover where they are in their hero's journey, and acknowledge that and sort of complete this loop of perspective and human connection.
Yes.
Which is truly magical.
I think so. I mean, not to be too cheesy, I almost didn't put this into my book, but somewhere I think the very last chapter of my book, I used the phrase conversational magic. And I had to resist hard using that phrase throughout the whole book because it's a little too cheesy, it's a little on the nose. But really, it's
up the cheese.
It's really just, for me, it's take what magicians do. What magicians take this antagonistic experience and they create this amazing, connected, extraordinary, uplifting thing out of it. And if only we could do that in our conversations, how much better would the world be?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we just make that your middle name now? Brian Conversational Magic Miller.
There you go. That has a nice ring to it. It's tight. I can get it into a username anywhere. I'm sure it fits on Twitter. Fantastic.
You can add it to your LinkedIn profile.
I will. It'll be under experiences.
So thank you so much for joining me. And I do look forward to additional deep dive meta conversations that we've had teasers for today. And right now, I do have a very important quest that you can help me with, which is that I would like to give you a purple kiss.
Fantastic. My
accept?
purple glass is accepted. There you go.
Okay. Wonderful. Let me give you one for Milo.
Oh, there it is. Milo will appreciate that.
And one for Lindsay.
Lovely. Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, I hope you find your wormhole back to us.
Yes, I hope that those prehistoric friends that I'm at campfire with won't eat me for dinner.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, tell them a story why they shouldn't.
Good idea. I've learned the hacks now today, so I'll be better off. I'll be well positioned.
All you need to say to them is, when you're hungry, what you want to do is not eat me.
Someone other than me.
Eat that guy. Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Or a purple kiss.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Brian. We'll meet again soon. Existential wave. With magic.